Another thing you can do and you should do is pay attention to who they're having you speak to, right? There's a certain level of sensitivity or tone deafness that a company might manifest in terms of the discussions you're having.
Nick, welcome to the show. Very grateful that you're on and you're going to spend some time with us today. I know time is very valuable at your level, so looking forward to it.
Same here, Mark. Great to be here with you. Look forward to it as well.
Great. So tell us where you're from in Trinidad, or more specifically like the Caribbean region. We represent the Caribbean, and where you live currently and sort of what you're working on at the moment.
Okay, sounds good. So I was born and raised in Barataria, Trinidad and Tobago. So Barataria is northeast Trinidad and Tobago. Strictly speaking, if you look at a map of Trinidad, it's obviously northwest. But the point of geographical reference is the infamous lighthouse. So grew up there, and from Trinidad, from Barataria, after completing high school at Fatima College, moved to the US for bachelor's, master's, PhD, and I know we'll get into that as well. So spent some time in Atlanta, spent some time in New York, have strong other Caribbean linkage. My wife is Jamaican from Kingston. I've been to Jamaica several times. And in terms of what I'm working on, so my trajectory into data science, AI, ML is unique, but not so unique. In the sense that my PhD, my degrees aren't in computer science. My degrees are in physics, math, PhD in applied physics. I specialized in building microprocessors at Columbia. Spent some time doing programming as part of that PhD program in C, C++, building programmatic models for data analysis, data computation with a variety of subroutines, etc. Never built production code, but once I joined IBM and I spent many years building microprocessors for IBM clients, OEM clients, and IBM systems, power systems, IBM mainframes. The presence in the industry, overall information technology, with the growth of data, as data continued to grow, and with the emergence of cloud as traditional IT began to be complemented and ultimately displaced in some cases with cloud, made that transition. And that's close to 10 years at this point. So today, fairly recently in a new role, lead a global team of 150 researchers or so, and we're focused on two things. We're focused on the automation of application lifecycle management in terms of their movement to hybrid multi-cloud architectures and application availability once they're in those environments, application security, application compliance. And it turns out that overall journey for traditional enterprises in particular is heavily influenced and can be simplified with AI ML. So this is AI ML applied to the software stack, not in terms of human language. We've spent a ton of time at IBM doing this, and over the last 6 or 7 years myself, looking at how this can be exploited. So that's one part of the portfolio. And the recent addition to that portfolio is in edge computing. Edge is growing, no secret to anyone listening to this podcast. And we are doubling down in terms of the investment we're making as far as edge computing is concerned. So yeah, that's my day job. And that's the new day job as of a month or so ago, and very excited about it.
Great. And you have a very, very important role in the future of kind of what things are going to look like, especially at the edge. And I think for many folks at home or just in general, thinking about how hard it is for a large company to migrate their infrastructure to the cloud, there are many things that I don't even sort of consider, especially when you start talking about security later on, right? So you've been at IBM for, I looked on LinkedIn, it's 19 years, right? And there are many different thoughts that come to mind when I think about that, in terms of people say, oh, you shouldn't stay at a company for a long time and blah, blah, blah. But it seems like you've definitely made a great career there. So why have you chosen to make a career at IBM? And more specifically, can you re-highlight the importance of IBM sort of in the world? I think if folks did not grow up in the early computing era, they really wouldn't appreciate the role that IBM played throughout.
Yeah, so this typically goes one of two ways. When I meet many millennials at recruiting events, what have you, and we have many millennials as well in my own organization, just to be clear, right? But when they get comfortable with me, my own cousin, right, who just finished his PhD in the UK, right? He himself, when he got comfortable, because we are second cousins, and we had heard about each other, but it took some time for us to get fully acquainted. And that question invariably comes up because IBM is going through that transformation. If I look at the last 3 quarters, led by our current CEO, Arvind Krishna, we've recorded growth in our earnings, and stock price Wall Street has responded we see adjustments in the stock price in a positive direction and so on. Market cap rising, which is the things that IBMers of old would have been familiar with. So in terms of, the question of why, if you look at the career I've had, I started off by saying I built microprocessors. I did that for the better part of 10 years as a physicist, as a material scientist, working on next generation devices. So in terms of device technology, I joined when device technology was heating up in terms of materials and new materials being introduced into what was then known as deep submicron. Right. When you contrast that with the 2 nanometer announcement that we just made, which in part facilitated this new Intel partnership, it pales in comparison, because back then you were looking at 130 nanometer node, 90 nanometer node.
Okay.
But IBM was on the forefront then, and continues to be, though no longer in manufacturing, from a device fabrication point of view. And it became a no-brainer for me, though I interviewed at many other places. Now, I hadn't had the foresight necessarily, even though I joined because of IBM's vertical integration, that I would have necessarily be doing what I'm doing today. That would be a lie, right? So after spending, the better part of 6 or 7 or so years working on everything facilitated and associated with what it means to build next-gen devices, like any good scientist, technologist, I was observing what was happening around us, both within the company and outside of the company. And as I mentioned before, tremendous growth in data. We were seeing that in many venues, many avenues. And then, of course, the emergence of cloud at around 2006. And though not having a PhD in computer science, a PhD really means you have the ability to learn new areas. And this is one of the things I tell people who I recruit, right? I have many people who work in my department. Their PhDs are in different areas. They may have started in distributed systems, but they're doing AI and software engineering, as an example. And that whole notion of how you manage and evolve your career is something that one has to pay constant attention to. There are people who have specialized in a specific thing, and they stay in that specific thing, of course, for their entire career. And I, by the way, could have done the same thing, even within IBM and certainly outside of IBM if I had chosen to do so. But for me, what was interesting was more where industry was going, both quote unquote SaaS enterprises, the Uber, Airbnbs of the world, the Netflixes of the world. But in addition, what traditional enterprises had to do. It was very exciting to me to see what you could do with data insights as you generate data from an enterprise point of view to help you with future lines of business, growth, customer sat, and so on and so forth. And so I started, doing like what many physicists actually within IBM have done. Interestingly enough, a couple of my mentors have a similar trajectory. And for the most part, the people in leadership positions don't necessarily have that same background, but many of us actually, interestingly enough, do. So that's why I said we're perhaps a majority within a minority. And so, coming back to the fundamental question that you asked about managing your career, I think, yes, there's a certain level of depth you need to have going into any field, whether you be a data scientist, a developer, machine learning expert, and whatever area of AI you might be specializing in, cloud, and so on and so forth. Thereafter, after delivering value, I think it's important to understand, what does your career mean to you? This to me is even more fundamental than, the area you specialize in. It comes back to what you're passionate about, right? What's your purpose, if you have identified that. And if you have those 2 P's identified, then the next P is about perspiring, right? Driving really aggressively and pursuing that passion and defining that purpose aggressively. So for me, interestingly, having done PhD in physics, having made major contributions to IBM technology roadmap for devices for 5 successive generations, I was at a juncture, and that juncture was propelling me into where industry was going, the emergence of data, the growth of cloud, the emergence of cloud. And though IBM responded a bit after others like Amazon and Microsoft, there was a perfect opportunity for me to segue. Given that I had delivered value before, it was certainly seen as an individual who can deliver value elsewhere.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack in that,
Sure.
and I think it's very important for folks listening, especially from high school, college, and the burning question I think in anyone's mind when they think about data science is like PhD or not. So we'll definitely come to that juncture. So we do the show to encourage people from home and in the diaspora to pursue data-driven careers, right? So can you share with us your view on how do you see machine learning, AI, and especially the cloud sort of playing an impact in the Caribbean's future?
Yeah, so completely ubiquitous, right? It's interesting because I have an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. My 10-year-old is very analytical, and I had him in a robotics course pre-pandemic. Last year it wasn't feasible, and this year I put him in another programming course along with his brother for the first time. His brother, like perhaps any young child, is enamored with the potential of video games. Of course, I manage screen time very aggressively. But having said that, I sort of tease out of them, what's the significance of this, right? How do you think this is working? Why do you think it's working? Do you want to understand what's behind these characters that you are able to manipulate on your screen? And so we're in an age where computer science is completely ubiquitous, irrespective of your background. It applies to chemical companies, it applies to agricultural companies, and typically at the application insight level, which is typically how many both small, medium, and large businesses enter into that AI transformation. Companies that are not necessarily digital by design. Of course, companies that are digital by design, that's an inherent part of their overall fabric. So when I think of the region, right, as you go across the various sectors, whether that be finance, whether that be agriculture, whether that be aviation, right, it doesn't really matter. There's the opportunity for small, medium, and large business, starting at the business insight level of leveraging the intelligence you can get from building models to understand customer behavior and so on, to ultimately do what? Help grow your business, help improve the relationship between clients, help uncover various unknowns that you might not have discovered had you not dug more deeply into the data and built a model and ultimately observe how that model evolved as you pass data through it. So there's that notion for sure as it relates to individuals coming out of school, irrespective, in my view, of your degree concentration and focus. I see this being completely critical, again, at the business insight level across those industries. But then if you peel that back a bit, similar to the UE lecture I gave a few weeks back, from a traditional enterprise point of view, much like Cal has already initiated and others are in pursuing a similar strategy, it's critical for those enterprises to adopt hybrid deployments for, if not anything else, eliminating technical debt. Many of these enterprises possess dated software stacks, and the management of that software stack creates an investment that's unnecessary, given if your core business is banking, your core business is aviation, telecommunications, what have you. And so clearly, of course, there are other reasons for keeping applications in-house, right? Be it proprietary, be it regulatory, what have you. But certainly not all applications need to remain there. And so the whole notion of getting these traditional enterprises to have a more digital footprint, much in the way, again, of Uber, Airbnb, Netflix, and the like, allows them to do what? At the business level now, with workloads that are running on hybrid architectures, given that you now can get into more agile process development, more agile application development, generate the insights they need. So, coming back to the fundamental question you asked, the region, of course, is, like you said, the focus of one of the reasons, certainly a heavy reason why we're putting this together. To me, this is completely ubiquitous, irrespective of where you are. And given the industries that we have, if you're a young hotshot coming out of UE, if you're a young hotshot coming out of UTT, if you're coming out of high school, right,
Mm-hmm.
with Coursera courses, with the machine learning courses online, you are able to supplement what you have learned, and you might have a fantastic idea, and you don't need to wait. That's to me, the beauty of this economy, which has emerged as a result of technology, both cloud and the revolution in AI.
Great. And I think one of the things I think a lot about for folks at home or just folks in general, your background is in physics and math, right? And I think there's this stigma about, hey, for me to enter into this field, I need to have that depth of knowledge or that amount of fundamentals. And to some degree, in different roles, right, there is that pure requirement that you are at that level. However, there's so much in the tech ecosystem, especially now as you start talking about the hybrid cloud ecosystem and then the edge computing ecosystem, where there are many different roles that you don't have to be as crazy technical. And I think one of the things we love to highlight in the podcast is, you're from the Caribbean, you can speak to many different types of people. So can you maybe give a piece of advice for folks who didn't have a physics and math background and what they should start to think about as their role in the new computing economy?
Yeah, this is an important point to touch on, because our culture, and by our culture, I'm going to broaden that beyond TNT to the English-speaking Caribbean and perhaps even broader to all of the Caribbean. Clearly, there's a heavy focus on academic excellence. And that's great, first and foremost, right? The likes of you, myself, and many others would not have been able to achieve the level of success we have achieved had we not have some level of academic excellence. So I certainly subscribe to academic excellence, to be clear. But coming back to the fundamental part of the question that you're asking, you don't have to be that particular specialist if you want to be in the space, right? Because the space offers many opportunities. You obviously, if you wanted to be the architect for a particular application that you're thinking of that can heavily disrupt some industry, much like Uber, Lyft did, much like Airbnb did, and so on. I keep coming back to those because they're quite relevant. Then if you want to be that architect, clearly you need to have that depth. Having said that, if you have a good sense of market dynamics, right? And this is an interesting thing that I discovered about myself. Again, that this was not what I was doing. I took maybe a microeconomics course at Morehouse College when I did my bachelor's degree, and that was it, right? While many others were pursuing heavy degrees in economics and finance. But one of the things I discovered as I was going through the process of making my transition, and quite frankly, maturing in the space as a scientist at IBM Research, was a keen awareness of where the market's taking you. And this is typically something anyone working in an industrial lab certainly grows into. And there's a sense of, okay, understanding the market and what particular technology problem can fit the market. That technology problem can also be early. We've seen that before as well. You might be a fast follower and you can be successful, or you might end up being too late of an entrant. Okay, so this is an interesting dynamic, because with the emergence of how ubiquitous CS, computer science, and cloud and AI are today, it's important that folks understand, yes, if you like that passion, and maybe you didn't start there, as coming back to the question that you asked, certainly if you want to be that architect, sure, you got to get deeper, okay, and make sure you possess those skills. But if you want to play in the space, you certainly need to understand what is happening at a particular level. But then by working with the right people, working with the architects, et cetera, you could find your niche as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you sort of highlighting sort of the breadth of things that folks can enter. You mentioned stuff about your kids, right? And how you are sort of guiding them to think a little more deeply about how does this new technological world work. And I think many people who may be listening may have kids at different ages, some young, some in their teenage years. What advice would you give to them? I think, I just spoke to someone recently, and their child was sort of, especially like a single mother. What should folks be listening out for? Because, and to some degree, you're a little biased in terms of like you are deep in the industry, so you can actually sort of project and give advice that will project a lot longer. But for folks who may not have that background, what are things that they should look out for? And one thing that means a lot for me is as a parent, if your background is not in that, definitely not limiting the child's outlook on what is possible.
Yeah, this is an important question, right? And in fact, I'll give you a quick joke as I answer the question. I was mentioning to one of my colleagues, his daughter is 15, and his daughter has done a number of Python summer camps and so on. And he's adamant she has to be a developer. She has to be an architect, right?
Right.
I said, suppose she's the next Mozart. Suppose she's the next, other expert outside of computer science. He's like, no, this is what she will do. And I think, I sort of retain a different perspective. And my perspective is the following, right? I think exposure is critical. My mother, didn't complete beyond a high school education, but had keen business insight, in part from her political affiliations, in part from running different businesses. And so was very successful doing so in raising two children on our own. My sister's a nurse, and you've heard my background. So ultimately, I think exposure is critical when I look back on what she was able to facilitate. Again, we're being raised in that island culture that we discussed before, where academic excellence is demanded. Certainly, I was a product of that. And I continue to, echo that for my kids, right? And they see that quite candidly today. But they also know, my wife's a dentist, and we don't push our kids to say, okay, so you have to be a dentist or a scientist technologist. That is not what we're saying. But you certainly have to understand the significance and importance. Now, coming back to the other side of what you asked, if you don't have that background, I think it's virtually impossible to not see the value, particularly in this pandemic, that technology plays and provides. And this is one of the things I try to communicate when I do some of these sessions, using Zoom. Zoom has 300 million, runs 300 million sessions a day. And to me, that's always mind-boggling. When you combine that now with WebEx, Skype and others, right, you're probably approaching 1 billion or so running on cloud infrastructure with a certain level of elasticity, resiliency. We haven't had, knock on wood, any issues in terms of our communication just yet. And we're talking about video together with audio. So if that alone doesn't allow you to develop an appreciation for, the significance of technology in terms of mere communication. Of course, there's much more than that, from credit card transactions to everything being heavily interconnected and driven by technology. As a person sitting outside of it, observing the world, again, this comes back to another key point, namely of having a growth mindset, right? If you don't have a growth mindset, you're probably not listening to this podcast. But if you do have a growth mindset and you're listening to this podcast, the idea is, pay attention to what's around you. Make sure you provide those opportunities through schooling and otherwise for your kids, because it's impossible, certainly by the time they reach your age and my age, for them to ignore technology, and certainly well before.
Yeah, and I think it's quite important, especially as parents. One thing that was very sort of clear to me is, I think back in the Caribbean region, you could have maybe not gone to school or may not have had certain skill sets, but you could have still found your way in the marketplace, right? And build a good life and, be successful and whatnot. And I think today it's very, very different, right? The cost of things, the opportunities that exist, I would say, are much more competitive. So you definitely need to separate yourself in the marketplace and setting up your kids for success. If you want them to have not a stress-free life, but a life where they can thrive, I think it's very important that you guide them in something in tech. And I think as you're saying, it doesn't have to be, but at least once they're exposed, they can now navigate their way through that new world,
Precisely. Their passion may lie within tech and not necessarily as a developer architect. Maybe, they get into the whole business context. Maybe they develop their own business, right? They create a startup that thrives, right? Maybe they join a larger corporation and become an offering manager for a product line. It can vary, but the key thing is potentially unlocking a passion that they may have that otherwise you would not have known.
Yeah, and so you mentioned passion a lot, and one thing that I've kind of learned as people learn about your career journey, you did math, physics, and chemistry. in high school, right? So let's kind of pause there and kind of tell us maybe why you chose those subjects.
Yeah, no, this actually goes back to a couple of things. It's definitely in part maternally influenced,
Okay.
right? In terms of, again, that culture of academic excellence, etc. But you may say, okay, academic excellence can span multiple things. Why science, right? There was certainly a push, right, from her point of view in that direction, perhaps in her own way, perceiving that that's more critical, maybe, right, as far as the future is concerned. But the other thing that started to happen fairly naturally was, as you know, like the typical kid, as I would get toys and so on, I would take them apart. You hear this story all the time, but it's true. I really wanted to understand, well, how does this thing really work? Invariably, I never put them back together, right? But that was part of the discovery process. And then back then, CNN ran a program weekly known as Science and Technology Week. And I would watch that vigorously, right? Quite attentively.
Yes.
And it covered a variety of things back then. So all of that really, you know, in the beginning, I thought, yeah, I wanted to be a pilot. You know, my adopted grandmother, I mean, she rest in peace. You know, I remember right before she passed, she remembered, you know, saying, you remember when you wanted to be a pilot? Obviously, that evolved to medicine, and, you know, you discover what you really like. Science is just one thing for you when you're a kid. And as you get deeper into science, you realize what it entails, right? Now, back then, CS was relatively immature. We're talking about things like Fortran and so on, right? It goes way back. So I didn't think I should do it at A levels. By the time I got to college, spent some time, did a few courses, and of course at my PhD did a few courses as well, but deeply into physics at that point in time, and saw myself, you know, continuing in that direction because of, again, what was pulling things then? It was the growth of IT, and the growth of IT back then was driven by scaling, right? Transistor scaling heavily. And so I gravitated towards that, you know, applied to a number of places. IBM, when I joined, had just done the first microprocessor that was enabled by copper interconnects, which significantly reduced the latency in comparison to aluminum interconnects. Others eventually followed suit, but IBM led the way in that regard. So it was a no-brainer by the time I joined. And I also joined in part because I saw the vertical integration and I figured I would evolve. Never thought it would be what's happening today, but I sort of foresaw, given that I get fairly bored quickly, I you know, said, okay, this is good. I like where they are. They're leading. Maybe I'll have the opportunity to evolve. And I love New York, so hey, perfect.
Game time.
Yeah, game time. Yep.
Great. And one thing I wanted to dive into was physics. And I've spent, you know, some interesting time with folks who have gone deep into physics. And I think you all see the world, and I'm, you know, definitely classifying you as a physicist, right? I would not classify myself as a physicist in terms of there's a deep appreciation for how things work, I think, in the world. And there's a certain amount of what I would call calculated optimism in addition to calculated pessimism as well. It could swing wildly in both ways. Can you share with us the value of maybe folks studying physics? I think as I've gone deeper into math, I've had a much deeper appreciation and respect for that topic.
Yeah, so, you know, a physicist would say that's clairvoyant. Someone outside of the field might say something else. I fully agree with you. You know, studying physics ultimately gets you to be quite philosophical as well. I don't know of a single physicist, whether they have remained, you know, core in academia, national labs, in the industry, or they have evolved like I have, who don't have a similar sort of philosophical appreciation, the calculated optimism and pessimism that you speak about. This is true because you really have to get to a level of precision. And I can tell you, when I first transitioned fully, right, even though I had some computing background, when I first transitioned fully, a number of things annoyed me. The use of platform across the board. Everything's a platform, right? And because there was a certain level of precision that I was accustomed to, it drove me significantly crazy. And my colleagues at work will tell you that. And perhaps I do the same thing now. You know, so there's an appreciation for sure, right? Do you have to have a physics background at, say, O level? Furthermore, at A level, I wouldn't argue that you need to. I think if you're passionate about understanding why, right, which is what physicists continually ask, and as you ask why, you invariably go deeper and deeper and deeper into the building blocks of everything, right? And this is what physicists tend to do, which is ultimately why I ended up there as opposed to something that was an amalgamation of those building blocks, right? Which is where I am now. But that perspective is an interesting one. And I would argue when you have that background and you get to the level where you're looking full stack, right, which is where I play now, there's a deeper appreciation that you seek in terms of understanding how well things connect, right? Why, you might be able to get some acceleration, for example, based on fundamental infrastructure elements, why it might be beneficial to running a machine learning model, especially when you think about edge computing in one location versus another, and a variety of other constraints. These constraints exist across the board, right? So the one thing I want to be careful about, though, if you're listening to this and you're in high school and you have your O-level subjects already chosen and physics isn't a part of that, that's okay. That just means it wasn't something you wanted to do, and that's perfectly fine. Likewise, if you're in A-level and you haven't chosen that, it's a question of whether you're passionate there. I think the bigger challenge, quite frankly, and I'll flip the question a little bit, if you're a core physicist, one of the things you could struggle with, given where society is evolving, where technology is evolving, right? As a core physicist, the opportunities to land roles that are core and not applied, those are increasingly difficult. And so you may end up, invariably many people think, okay, I have to end up in academia, right? That's certainly an option, but not the only option. You may end up at a national lab, right? And of course, those are quite prevalent across the US and parts of Europe and so on and so forth. But if there's a notion within you of, looking at applied areas, all right, quantum computing is growing, and the ability to understand those device geometries as you deal with error correction and the challenges in quantum. Physics background certainly is beneficial there. But interestingly, the blend of a physics background and a computer science background turns out to be quite beneficial there too. So, it's interesting because, and I'll sum up by saying the following. The interdisciplinary nature of work today ultimately means you will be touching different pieces. So that doesn't mean you become a generalist from high school, right? That's impossible. You can't be, right? But ultimately getting to a level where you can have an appreciation for what it means to be interdisciplinary, I view as key.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sort of expanding on that, because I think what I've gained an appreciation of in physics, I did physics in high school, but I didn't really understand. I didn't necessarily resonate with the subject as a physicist to ask the deeper questions. And the reason why I brought up this topic is because you mentioned that word precision. And I think the lesson to take away for folks who maybe have not studied physics or will never study physics in their life is this notion of first principles, and that I'm at NVIDIA now, and the CEO Jensen is all about first principles, and like Elon Musk ascribes to that as well, and there's this very clear view of how things work. It's very sort of unbiased, and it's just very objective as to what needs to be done, and sort of the elements that sort of lead to whatever success you're going for. So I think if you can adopt a physicist mindset such that, hey, there's a certain level of precision I need to get to. I think another interesting thing that you mentioned, like getting annoyed. Physicists do tend to get very annoyed at things that are not precise, and that drives them to get other things done, which is great, right? Which is actually a pretty useful trait to just move fast, I would say, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. But as you say this, something else popped into my head, and I want to share really quickly. In my time, the last 10 years or so in computer science and across, the full stack and different capabilities and domains within CS, one thing has emerged, and I think it probably holds true. People who are experts in programming languages, they tend to think the same way, actually. And it's interesting because the more I interact with programming language experts, right, in my team and overall within research and other parts of IBM, I see those traits. So, I guess I'm coming back to the question you asked, right? I fully agree. There's a certain level. If you're pursuing any type of career, it's not a fly-by-night thing, to use a local expression, right? It is governed by a certain set of core principles, right? And the more you can understand those as you respond to your passion that comes up again, right? The more you will find joy in pursuing that purpose that you have identified. Now, if you made a miscalculation, that's okay too. Pivot. That's what agility is all about. Doesn't only apply in application building, it applies in your life. Now, obviously, clearly the risk reward you have to think through when you talk about pivoting, right? But coming back to that point, I did want to bring that up because if you like, as you explore programming languages and understand what it means as languages evolve and you use languages to build, this is an interesting concept that seems to be emerging as well. People within CS refer to programming languages experts as the physicists of CS. I've heard that expression as well.
Yeah, and they're very like super rigorous. And I think adopting a level of rigor in anything that you do, I think will always pay off. So wanted to hop into your college experience, right? What was your mindset like in high school, by the way, in terms of, I need to get out there. I'm sure mom was, cracking whips on you, especially you probably, just have a ton of energy and don't know really what to do with it. So tell us about that. What was your mindset like? And I think that's really important, especially at your level.
Agreed. She was cracking multiple whips. I agree on my sister and myself. And it was a no-brainer at that point, as I was matriculating through sixth form, that I would apply to university. What was uncertain was, would I get, financial assistance, right? And I was pretty clear that I was going to pursue some physics, electrical engineering, math type of combination, right? So I applied to a number of places, the Ivy League institutions and non-Ivy League institutions, and various offers came through. And in the end, I took the offer from Morehouse, where there were other Fatima, ex-Fatima students, Fatima alumni who were there, many of whom I'm still in touch with, still close friends with. And they spoke highly, right? Back then, that was 1993. The reputation of Morehouse wasn't perhaps as well known, perhaps as it is now. And we tend to have this mindset that your bachelor's degree has to be at this Ivy League institution. That certainly was the environment in which I was raised. And so what these guys did, they really helped me to understand, not only the history of the school and other schools that I should potentially apply to, the camaraderie. You're not thinking about the emotional, mental challenges that you will undergo invariably when you leave home, right? You're thinking about going to be pursuing this degree. I'm excited. This is what I'm good at. This is what I'm passionate about, but you're not coupling these other factors. So my eventual roommate also came from Fatima, and we roomed together, close friends today and best friends today. And that helped both of us. And then, of course, the upperclassmen who were from Trinidad and Tobago as well, and a variety of different schools. So the experience was great, in part because of the legacy those guys had set. If you stepped onto campus and folks who you were from Trinidad and Tobago, they assumed you were bright. Yeah. So that was interesting, right? Oh, you must be smart. You're from Trinidad and Tobago. That was easily the first thing that was said, during freshman year upon meeting people. Physics, not as well known for, because it's a small liberal arts school, right? Probably better known, actually, not only from a civil rights point of view in terms of people like MLK, et cetera, but the finance program had always been strong. Many graduates went on to Wall Street, et cetera. So I would argue, from a fame point of view, that's what the school was known for. But very strong engineering program with dual degree programs with Georgia Tech, University of Michigan, and the core STEM disciplines from math, physics, chemistry, biology. Very strong departments, a lot of external funding. And it was great because the rigor was the same. I had a professor who has since retired from Guyana, and he drove a level of rigor in us, right? Dr. Moore, I remember him vividly. Saw him recently. We presented him with an award, a plaque to commemorate, his service upon his retirement. The chair at that time was Dr. Dixon, and American professor, but similar level of rigor. There were many West African professors from Nigeria. So irrespective of where these guys were from and where they did their degrees, the one constant there was similar to what we had experienced, growing up and pursuing A levels in TNT, namely a certain level of rigor, right? And the new thing, though, just to be clear, right? because obviously that's what we were accustomed to. The new thing was make sure you get out there and you use your summers wisely to land opportunities, to land internships, right? And so that was drilled into us from very early. So I spent my first summer actually at University of Washington, Seattle, working on mass spectrometry of proteins, right? So the only physics part there is, mass spec machines in terms of separation particles based on their charge to mass ratios. But the application of it, and you could argue it opened up, or turned on a light bulb in my head, because how you use, physics principles and physics tools in an applied setting is really what that was all about. So understanding the significance of protein synthesis and the like, that's, apart from being in the Pacific Northwest, which was a fantastic experience in the summer, right, as opposed to outside of the summer. And this continued, right? We were encouraged with the chair of physics, chair of math as well, to ensure you gain practical experiences so that you figure out what your job would look like. Because unless you're, going to teach, so to speak, high school, college, what have you, your job will be different from what you're experiencing in the class. And that was very valuable because not only myself, but many others did that. One of the upperclassmen, for example, who was a strong mentor, I'll actually highlight two of them. One went on to work for a variety of oil companies and is home now in a major position in the oil industry. Another worked for Corning, right? And, is doing fantastic stuff in photovoltaics in the DC area. So you see this notion of how, these are all physics background individuals, and some have PhDs in physics as well. They all ended up in various applied settings. Myself, of course, in heavy CS domain and in the intersection of AI and cloud. So, to summarize the question you asked, I would say there were two critical things I would want to highlight from a college point of view and in selecting the school. The school obviously needs to be good at what you want to major in. There's no debate about that. A support network is critical for anything, not only undergrad, but, grad and beyond, right? Those are absolutely critical things. And so selecting a school where, you have some level of support, that should be, top of your mind. And secondly, given the nature of the world today in terms of how figuring out what it is you do, by all means, seek internship opportunities. I'll end by saying on my recruiting trips, I meet a ton of students. There was a student who I interviewed. We eventually made an offer to her for a summer internship. She had internship experiences. She was from the Bay Area. She had internship experiences at high school level at the likes of LinkedIn and other major companies. And that's not unheard of. But that's the type of competition that you're facing today, right, when it comes to seeking and landing opportunities to grow.
Yeah, getting internships, I think I have the inverse story if we go into parallel universes, right? Where I got my first internship in my last year of my PhD, right? Whereas you got yours in your first year of your bachelor's. So, and I think throughout my entire academic career, that was always burning in my mind. And it's, I wouldn't say it's for lack of effort, right? I think it's a function of network, who you're exposed to, in addition to your degree. Like I did chemical engineering, you did physics and math. And one of the things I think when you choose a particular degree, I don't want to say people judge you, but people project from that degree what you can do. So for instance, if you're a chemical engineer, I want you to do marketing. Okay, like you know nothing there, but maybe physics and math. You could probably pick up CS. You could probably pick up other things. So these fundamental degrees end up shaping the perception that you are presented with, or how you're perceived by other hiring managers. Let's say, like, this guy, he can do this, he can do that, because he had to do all these different things. So I think even if you don't have internships, maybe just trying to. A lot of my successes come from volunteering, actually, and hustling like crazy. Which, coming back to something that you mentioned in your statements, is that network, right? Of especially folks who've gone beyond you from the Caribbean. It seemed that to have a great impact on your overall outlook and guidance in school. So can you maybe rescore the importance of having that network, especially early on?
Yeah, and I want to circle back as well on what you said in terms of the perception of what you can do based on your degrees. First of all, never let anyone tell you what you can or cannot do. That's a message for the listeners. And I think it's interesting because if you're pursuing the quote unquote traditional route of joining an enterprise, a company, a tech provider, right? Inspect the culture of that tech provider. Interestingly, right, the culture within IBM is very much one of people can do different things. Okay, because you have many past individuals who have different types of backgrounds who've rose to successful executive type roles. Lou Gerstner, who transformed IBM many years ago, was running potato chips company before he took over the job as CEO and transformed IBM. And so that openness to anyone being able to pick up at the right level, of course, it would take time for me to become a programming languages expert, but I don't need to be. I have them around me. And together with the other experts, I can shape and drive a strategy and execute accordingly. So I really want to highlight that because if a culture within an enterprise, within a startup, within a major company is such that there are inhibitors to you progressing, it's probably not the right place because it would become difficult if you want to evolve. But then back to the specific question that you asked, it's absolutely critical to grow your network. Now, I have a perhaps different perspective on how you do that. In the age of, API transactions, there's the notion of instantaneous networking, speed networking. I personally find that challenging. And here's where I'm coming from. If a network with an individual, he or she is built through a more organic means and there's a natural connection, I believe you will derive a whole lot more from that. Now, I'm not saying that every network needs to be of that nature, right? In some cases, it's simply, one person putting you in touch with another so that you have a sponsor in a job that you apply for, as an example, or a sponsor from a VC point of view to help get your project off the ground. All of those are useful. General rule of thumb, though, I would recommend avoid the notion of API-based networking. Okay,
yes.
Make your networks rich, organic, and I think you would derive so much more from such networks.
Yeah, I appreciate you calling out organic networks because I have a fundamental rule on LinkedIn for anyone I ever talk to: don't ever connect with someone, especially if you're a student early in your career. Do not connect with. If I wanted to connect with you, I would have never reached out on LinkedIn and connected. I would have followed you. I would have gone and watched all the posts that you post, and I would have probably courted you for about 2 or 3 months in terms of sharing your content, helping you to build your brand and earning that connection. And I think what I end up seeing in some people is, oh, why wouldn't you connect with me? And we're from the same place and whatnot. And I think people don't really respect or understand, especially at your level, the amount of things that you have coming at you, the level at which you have to sort of operate, and the things that you're responsible for, and how much you are trying to squeeze out of a unit per unit of time to just take 30 minutes to talk to someone that you're going to repeat the same conversation to, I don't know, 10,000 people. You'll never get anything done. So I think, reaching out to folks like yourself, coming with a very specific focus and essentially being okay with earning it. I think that's one thing that maybe some folks need to get comfortable with, in terms of, it's not because we're from Trinidad, yeah, like we connect and talk, and like you have a whole multi-billion-dollar business to run. Otherwise, you won't have a job, right?
It's interesting to hear you put it the way you did, because I don't know that I have met a lot of folk who think it through that way, right? And there's value in thinking it through the way you've done, because, obviously I get the whole notion of, yes, XYZ may be able to assist because of what have you. I get that, right? But if you pursue the relationship with only that in mind, it's not from a position of the whole notion that we are putting together here, right? We are putting together, you are putting together, you are leading this initiative, yes, to inspire other individuals coming up who can see success stories, get advice on how to be successful in data, AI, ML, cloud, what have you. Fantastic. But there's a role they play as well in the individuals who come potentially after them, potentially adjacent to them. And so if they are intrinsically not fundamentally getting what you're saying in terms of how you approach networking, it means that there is no continued passage, no continued pull. And that's really what we're after, right? It doesn't stop with the first group that are positively influenced through the podcast. It presumably continues with what they do as well.
Absolutely. And one of the things I wanted folks to understand, I've been fortunate enough in this group to meet folks like yourself at your level. And, we're not talking about classes and rank and all that, but having a much deeper appreciation for there's a different way of thinking. There is a different level of execution at your level that you have to drive towards, completely different mindset. All the lazy tendencies that we have. I think you probably have to shrug off your whatever natural laziness tendencies, much faster and much more often. So what would you say to professionals who want to get to the VP level? They want the title, right? But what does it really take to play that game?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's the whole notion of delivering value. That it always starts with that. There's value that you have to be delivering in your roles. You have to be associated with delivering value and across the board, right? People will evaluate you based on that. Okay. The network comes into play because if you deliver value, but you're not viewed as a team player, that's an issue as well. When you talk about, large organizations, small organizations, right? The ability to be a team player is key. So I would highlight that, underscore that as well. It's okay to admit what you don't know, right? To your teams. I'm very comfortable with that. Yeah, and perhaps influenced in many ways because I made a transition from an area that I was very deep in to one that I wasn't as deep in at all. Okay, and so I think people, it's a refreshing thing for people when they hear, oh, wow, he asked me my opinion. He wasn't sure, right? And I try to instill that type of culture in the organizations that I build. And so interestingly, when you get associated with delivering value, being a team player, being okay to not be the smartest guy in the room, which is a way of paraphrasing what I said a second ago, you find that there's a lot of positivity that can come out of that. Now, there's a lot of experiments that you're doing. If you're in an environment where a company is rising tremendously, maybe you can ride that wave, right? That's not the position I'm in as we continue to make investments to make a turnaround, which seems to be happening and going in the right direction based on the past 3 quarters. So we have to continue pedaling. And therefore, there's a specific metric that's being put over my head by, ultimately the CEO and people who report into him and my superiors that ultimately determine how well I do. So I will underscore those 3 things. Those are absolutely critical. You talked about, I'll touch really quick about shrugging off certain tendencies. It's said that before we do anything, we have to read a newspaper and have a doubles, right? Or whatever the new expression might turn out to be. It was certainly relevant when I was an undergrad. And, interestingly, I was always type A, always very aggressive and passionate about what I pursued, but I was definitely reading a newspaper and eating doubles, in quotes before I started what I had to do. That's less so now. I mean, if it exists at all, I get up, right? If I'm heading into the office, I jump in my car. I might be taking calls on the road. If I'm working from home, I do exactly what I'm doing here, right? There's a quick drink of tea, or the tea is packed at my side, and I jump right into it. There's no unwinding for 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. I just don't have that luxury. So does that mean I'm less Trinidadian? I would argue not, right? So having said that, though, there's a ton of positive stuff we bring, in terms of who we are, right? Or we can bring. Obviously, there's an individual personality. All 1.4 million of us are not 100% alike. That's not the case. And so allow yourself to be you is one of the things I would say. There's another executive, and she's based on the West Coast. She's from the Virgin Islands, IBM as well. And when she was interviewed last summer, I believe, or last February, to be more precise, she talked about allowing yourself to be yourself. I would strongly emphasize that. Don't think that you need to go into that role not allowing yourself to be you. there's three phrases within IBM: I belong, I matter, and there's a third one that's escaping me at the moment. And the idea there is to be inclusive, right? So back to the point I made in terms of the culture at IBM allowing you to redefine, reinvent yourself, there's also this notion of inclusivity, which has been driven very strongly and increasingly, with the unfortunate events of last year. And that allows me, in speaking to any executive, right? My accent comes out the way it's coming out now. They know I'm not from wherever. They can't potentially place it. Maybe they think it's Jamaican, what have you. Those who are well-traveled know otherwise and are able to specifically hone in on that. And it's fine. I don't need to sound like I grew up in New York or what have you.
So the fact that you bring out the accent, and I think some personal stories in my life, like just keeping your accent from home it's almost like a signaling mechanism, right? You're out in this big crowd and someone hears your voice and like, huh, where you from? And that's you talk about this organic connection, and that's, one of the quickest ways to gain an organic connection. Someone might, I met people where, they have family members who are from Trinidad, so we form a connection. They're not even Trinidadian, and that has led to certain things, even I would say to this podcast. So I appreciate the fact that you're calling out, just kind of be yourself, especially at your level. I think even some of my preconceived notions, you're going to be a VP, like, all right, CEO, you have to act and, be straight up and whatnot. And I wanted to share a lesson I learned from the CEO of my company, Jensen Wang. And he was like, don't be a know-it-all. Like, know-it-alls don't get much done, right? And they're not very good. They're not fun to be around. So it's okay to just say, hey, yeah, I don't know this. And creating that culture of just acceptance. Like, hey, you don't know something. Okay, you're smart enough to figure it out. And you have enough peers where, we can get it done. So you keep saying certain words that, as I've traveled in my career, I appreciate more now. One is mentorship, two is culture. And I think maybe at home, in the companies at home, folks don't get to experience an interesting sort of global culture, which ends up shaping sort of your view of the world. So what can you say about culture, and what are the elements that people should be looking out for to take into their own career paths?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So, and yeah, maybe folks who might not, maybe you're part of an enterprise home that is regional, and so maybe you get some sense of that as well. Uh, we in the region, right, and in Trinidad and Tobago, there's a distinct regional culture for sure, and it permeates all industry, right, to a significant degree. In North America, in Europe, in Asia, right, the elements of those cultures are intertwined, with a corporate culture, right? And I think one of the things you can do is by meeting individuals and asking questions, right? If you, whatever you are interested in doing, if a particular company begins to appeal to you, small, medium, or large, advice I also gave my cousin fairly recently, right, in his selection choice, understand from the people who are there what the culture is like. Ask those deliberate questions. Another thing you can do, and you should do, is pay attention to who they're having you speak to, right? There's a certain level of sensitivity or tone deafness that a company might manifest in terms of the discussions you're having. So I know of an individual, for example, she was contemplating making a move from one tech company to another tech company. I'll just say it like that, right? And in her experiences, and she's, was medium level, entry level executive. And the people she spoke to, not at one point in time did she speak to a female developer, engineer, or executive. Not one point in time did she speak to an engineer, developer of color. Now, does that mean that they had none? Probably not. But it's certainly a level of tone deafness manifested if you're trying to bring this individual into your environment. So you may say, are you going there to do that? And, at the end of the day, representation always matters, because unless you're making a short pit stop, like in the pits where you come, you change tires and you move on. This is not, I like to say, the roles we have, it's not the same as an athlete making a pit stop for a year and then transferring to another club. Right. That's not quite what it is. Okay. Your stops tend to be a bit longer. Okay. And the ability to continue and moving on, putting myself aside. Yes, you highlighted this at the beginning, right? 19 years at IBM. but have had easily 6 or 7 careers within those 19 years. So it's almost as if I have moved across companies within a company. And so given that umbrella, think through the people who they, introduce you to speak to, et cetera, et cetera. That matters. And if you're not doing that, if they are not doing that, you get a good sense of what the culture is like. And if they are doing that, then ask those questions. And then, of course, for many of these companies, there's stuff out there in the press and social media. You should certainly read that with the right level of filtering. Some of that may or may not be true, but you can certainly get acquainted with what their corporate citizenship looks like. I think these are important things because certainly as I look at myself as a parent now, maybe it was less important when I wasn't a parent, but as my boys are getting older, I want to be able to not only explain what I do, but stand behind decisions we make company-wide that affect society. To me, that's very significant. Okay?
Right.
As they begin to ingest and get more familiar with, the challenges that the world faces.
Culture. So it's interesting that you sort of highlight that. And I think even before you said that, I only maybe have heard one other instance of paying attention to that element in your career. So thanks for calling that one out. And the other thing I wanted to get to very quickly was you said delivering value, right? So you've had 6, I believe, distinct careers in IBM. And I think when people think about, and this is something I'm learning at NVIDIA, right? Where the CEO basically says, this is the place to do your life's work, which is a very loaded statement. Like one might say, oh, yeah, he just wanted to come work for his company for your whole life, right? But then he says, like, hey, everyone here is a volunteer, right? If you don't want to do it, leave, right? It's very, very clear cut. So you end up seeing people who they put their everything into a job. And it's very, I feel very fortunate to experience a culture like that. Not necessarily every company maybe has the financial mechanisms to create something like that. But you highlighted delivering value. And I think, can you tell us, one, there's a mindset. 2, I think there's also maybe a scoping of opportunity. And I don't know if that maybe has come from your Caribbean background. Like you can meld with a bunch of different people. And you're like, oh, I'm doing physics here. I'm seeing these cloud people over here. Tell us maybe about, how important that is to career progression.
Yeah. So first of all, every enterprise is going to have some management process as it relates to performance, right? Whatever that looks like. Many companies have done away with stack ranking, but you're still evaluated, okay? And that whole evaluation process is going to examine how well did you deliver what you were supposed to deliver. Now, at the end of the day, if you're in a research organization, much in the way I am, there's experimentation that you do, all of which doesn't pan out. That's obviously the case, right? However, when it comes to the evaluation, right, based on what you were supposed to do, whether that actually turns out to be tangible innovation that impacts the market or not, you are going to be, evaluated based on that. So with that in mind, joining any enterprise and not paying attention to your performance metrics and what that means ultimately means you're not thinking through what your future is. And if you've gotten that far, right, with bachelor's, master's, PhD degrees, presumably that's not how the mindset you're taking into the role. So now progressing past that part, right, there's a sense of technical and non-technical. Technical, obviously, if there's an approach you have to take, let's take something that's even further baked, right? It has gone beyond, prototyping, and it's essentially, in advanced development, okay? And maybe there's a product out there already, and you're continuously improving it, okay? A service out there. So there's, again, metrics that are applicable to that. And obviously there's a technical approach that you take in terms of what you need to do, the Scrum process, you're practicing agility, you're getting feedback from the market, you're tweaking appropriately, etc. A lot of this, though, does fall into a non-technical category, and it spans broad teams. If you're in a dev organization, a development organization, right, presumably, right, you have others you can rely on in terms of client interaction or offering interaction. The tighter that is, and the more effective you can be in bringing those together, the more effective you will be in delivering value. So that's the approach I've taken, even when I was a contributor, as opposed to an exec leading a large team. So now, as an exec leading a large team, I ensure that I have strong partnerships with my brands, who are the IBM business units, who are receiving the capabilities we build to put into their various products, right? Both software and services. And continuously working directly with clients, getting client feedback so that we can, back to the beginning of the pipeline, begin to think through whether or not there's a scalability challenge here, there's a usability challenge here, what have you, and think through from a design and implementation point of view the pivots we need to make. So does our background help? It absolutely does, because I meet people from all over the world. We might have cricket in common, football in common, food in common, you name it, right? And that, that makes the conversation light from time to time. There's a fellow IBM exec. He's from India, and I remember when we were going through this bad spell where we hadn't won a test match. I was having this discussion with him, and I said, do we have to keep doing this? He said, yes, until you win a test match. But he was joking, right? But it was fun. It made things light, right? Because we were in a tight situation there in terms of what we were trying to do, and it lifted, the sort of burden, so to speak, for the moment. So again, that's why I come back to this sort of grounding, technical, non-technical. There's what you have to do technically, okay, and you should be doing that to deliver value. But don't divorce your personality non-technically in terms of, because at the end of the day, we're people, and you're trying to make a team, however big that team is, depending on the scale of the product, whether it's something new, if it's an MVP or something that's mature, what have you, you're trying to make a team successful, okay? And in a dynamic market with competition, that's incredible. In a pandemic reality, there's a lot you have to think through. So bring all of you, and perhaps that's what, your CEO means, right? In terms of volunteering, bring yourself, your whole self to that job. And it's not something, I'll be clear, it's not something that I did at the beginning. At the beginning, I, obviously you knew, because I could never, hide my accent, so to speak, but yeah. I brought fully, right, the technical side of me, okay? And I was the individual who thought he had to be the smartest in the room, but that evolved over time as I grew, as I learned, as I met others who weren't. And the last thing I'll say on accent, there's a ex-IBM executive. He ran our power business for many years, IBM Power Systems. He's now an executive at General Electric. Also a Fatima alumnus, interestingly. The first time I heard him speak to a bunch of senior executives, so he left IBM and was a former general manager, right? So GMs run billion-dollar businesses, just to put it in context. At other companies, he would be a CEO. First time I heard him speak, I said, wow, Colin's accent is like 100% there. This is wonderful. I was, a new employee. So it gave me that comfort. Now, you wouldn't have that opportunity at every, tech company across the board as you go across, FANG and so on, right? But just take note and listening to what we are discussing here, that it's okay to do so. It's okay to bring 100% of yourself.
Yeah, and, the accent, it's cool, especially like when you hear an executive level, like, oh, wow, that dude got up there, or that woman got up there. And like, yeah, you can kind of do it. And I think that's the main mission with this podcast, is to remind you and to just give you more data points, right? To remind you that it is possible. Wherever you kind of want to go, your path is going to wind around maybe to many different companies, or like yours, you innovate within a company, all right? And then actually have a tremendous amount of impact. So as we transition nearer to the end, I think this is probably even more important for you these days. How do you sort of find work-life balance, right? I think that's often a deciding factor of, all right, do I want that much stress? Yeah, you're making more money, blah, blah, blah. But, everything has a price, but how do you sort of manage those things?
Yeah, and this is something I see of yourself, right? As fast as something, first thing I'll say, as fast as something gets on my plate, I get it off in an efficient way, not obviously in a reckless way, right? That's one thing. I believe in efficiency and execution. Time management is a critical part of this. Absolutely critical part of this. So I was up quite early, as an example. It's Saturday, of course, so that doesn't apply, but we are doing a technical podcast, work-related podcast on a Saturday, right? So there's at least 4 different things that I got done this morning prior to this, and there's 4 more I'll get done after this, and socialization and so on and so forth. I'm always at my kids' games, right? My oldest son plays tennis, my younger one plays soccer. I'm actually missing soccer practice now, but my wife has taken him there, and that's fine, right? I make sure that I'm present at their matches, at their practices, right? Their school events, what have you. my wife and I, once a week, in the week itself, Monday to Friday, we try to find a day where we may have a drink, maybe have
Mm-hmm.
dinner outside of the house, right? And that helps. Obviously, the pandemic, has put a monkey wrench on many of those things, but with the state of New York currently able to resume a lot of that. So yeah, it comes back fundamentally to the things you're passionate about. It's if family is critical to you, if your network is critical to you, you have to allocate time. Now, balance doesn't mean it's averaged, so to speak. It's temporally averaged. It's
Mm-hmm.
not on a day basis. It's more like on a week to month basis. Okay, and so that's the approach I try to take, ensuring the right touch points. We have multiple of those that we can exploit with our family, friends, and so on. We just took a trip, which was long overdue with not only our nuclear family, but my mother-in-law, my mother, right, to spend time with the grandkids. So we were away for a week and a little bit. So I really believe in this because at the end of the day, we're people first, right? If I had an epiphany one day and I decided to join the Peace Corps, I'm no longer at IBM. What do I have left? Yes, I have what I did at IBM and in the industry and technology, right? But family ultimately and the things that I'm passionate about. So time management is a critical part of this, right? Efficiency and execution from a work point of view is another. It does raise the question, though, whether or not you want to go beyond a particular level. I've gotten that question many times, right? My one of my physicians said to me after he heard about my promotion, he said, how high do you want to go? Do you see yourself as CEO? Given that this is a public podcast, I'll leave that alone for now,
Yeah.
right? But at the end of the day, I think it really comes down to, you know, uh, are you doing what you want to do? Because when you max out a role, I don't believe it's worth it to stay in the role, right? And you should never leave a role when it's maxed out. It should be right before, because the time you max it out, you will know you will not have the same passion, right? You will not wake up the same way with the same level of enthusiasm to do it. And by the way, just to be clear, that's one thing. There are other things aside adjacent to that you might be doing, like driving a podcast for the region, like writing a book, like I did a few years back. So all of these bring together your whole self. I do believe, in the notion of reevaluating what you do. And if you're in a role 2 to 3 years and you like that, you haven't maxed it out, by all means, keep pushing, right? If you're able to wake up every day and find value from it, then that's fantastic. That's ultimately the fundamental question to answer. And so there is a limit, though. I do agree, right? Maybe some individuals that's becoming a CEO. For others, that's not having that much time consumed. The higher you go, clearly, the more or less of your time, I should say, that you would have, because the responsibilities are huge.
Yes. I appreciate you sort of saying, are you doing what you want to do? I think I recently made a team transition and it's on to, the CEO's top priority, right? And he basically said, like, if you're not waking up every day in a panic, that's not a good thing. You should be in a panic. But what he said was quite interesting is that if you don't have a strategy, you won't be in a panic. If you have a strategy, you'd be in a panic because you want to execute on that strategy. And that was just kind of blew my mind, at least at my level. And I think I definitely take that one, are you doing what you want to do? And just jumping in and just knowing that there's a certain amount of threshold and changing your own mentality where, okay, there's more work, but it's actually your mind has to adjust to this level of work and it becomes the same, low level of work that you're kind of accustomed to maybe. So as we get closer, what are 3 principles you live by? You shared certain things along the way, but can you summarize them?
Yeah, and I want to quickly touch on what your CEO said. It's said another way, it's embracing discomfort. I like how he phrased it. If you have a strategy, you should be in a state of panic because you see what's in front of you and you're like, okay, there's a lot that I need to do to execute on this strategy. So I can't agree more. It's a different way of stating embracing discomfort from both a personal and organizational viewpoint. And I think it's what true leaders live by and ultimately are able to drive value by adopting such principles. My own principles, I sort of highlighted before, right? to me, it comes down to really, three essential things, right? There's the notion of, again, being passionate about what you do. I really come back to that,
Yes.
right? If you're not passionate about what you're doing, you shouldn't be doing it. You'll have difficulty waking up. You'll have difficulty doing it. Find purpose, establish purpose in what you're doing, right? Through that purpose, you may derive passion as well. The passion might very well be intrinsic, but then the combination is unbeatable because you found purpose, life purpose, whatever that is, okay? And you are passionate about it. That's a necessary but not sufficient condition to deliver value and to be successful at it. You have to perspire, right? And so make sure you put your shoulder to the wheel to execute. Now you can apply that to all of life, but when you step back a bit, ultimately that comes down to people. That comes down to the relationships you build, the relationships you nurture organically, okay? And fundamentally, again, because we are people, just remember that we are engineers and technologists, secondly, not firstly. Firstly, we're human beings. So always remember the value of life and how in your life, through the efforts that you put out, you can influence and shape others. Those are
Great.
fundamentally how I try to live, both from a work-life balance point of view and generally.
I see you can't take the physicists out of Nick necessary and sufficient conditions, I was like, oh, we're doing a proof here today.
Always.
So what are two pieces of advice you'd have for a high schooler, a person in college, and a professional?
Yeah, good question. High schooler, open mind with respect to where your future can go. Even if you think you're already hell-bent on being XYZ, because you're at that phase where you should be taking in a lot, okay, as you do your coursework, etc. And maybe, like I've seen others who have done, get an internship in that space, even at the high school level. I think it will help you, especially if you think you have an idea of where you want to go. Certainly for the college student, absolutely ensure you're meeting people, you're networking organically, and you're experimenting with what role you might potentially have eventually by doing internships. Okay, I can't underscore that enough. For the professional, this is interesting, right? So for the professional, it's a continuous reevaluation of what you do, even when it's new, right? Because that comes back to having a strategy and being in a state of panic because you have a strategy and embracing the discomfort that comes with being in that state of panic. That reevaluation is key because we're in a dynamic world. Professionals in tech who understand that quite clearly. Of course, the pandemic has accelerated a lot of technology, and obviously there's a goodness that comes from that specifically. But the dynamism in the planet, with the problems that the planet has to solve, that really haven't changed that much. They've been there all along, from injustice to poverty, and now the rise of infectious diseases. Technology has a role to play, and because a strong role to play, and because of that, right? As an individual, if you have core principles that align to some degree with what I articulated before, that reevaluation will help you in navigating forward, especially when it comes to leaving something for your kids to take over and learn from, the next generation to take over and learn from.
Fantastic. Yeah. Now you make me think about, hey, it's Saturday, I need to go reevaluate what I'm going to do next week. And I think that's what I've learned from speaking to a lot of folks, especially at your level, is just that constant reevaluation of, hey, are you doing the right thing? And that's very interesting that you pointed out before. You shouldn't necessarily stay in a role until you max it out, because you end up taking out the passion that you end up coming there with. And I guess that, affects your reputation overall, right? If you drop in
100%.
performance. So last question, what 3 books do you recommend?
It's a good question.
Are you a big reader?
Yeah, not as much as I need to be. Yeah, what 3 books I recommend? That's a good one. I recommend this for a different reason, not because I'm an IBM, but it's a good book. Who Says Elephants Can't Dance? I recommend that.
What?
Yeah, Lou Gusino. Right.
Okay.
I had the privilege of meeting him and getting that book signed by him. Yeah.
Very interesting.
It's a good leader. Well, the reason I recommend it, right, from a leadership point of view, it's a good book giving you insight into enterprises, market dynamics, right,
Okay.
culture, all of those factors, right? So that's a good one. I recommend this one from the point of view of if my story is inspirational to you and you care to hear more, I recommend this for sure. Struggle and Progress. It's my own, very own, right, book. And I'll give you a quick glance here on screen.
All right.
And quick story on that. The inspiration from that came from my own family in many ways, but I had friends in my network advocate to publish it. And, that led to so many different things because it wasn't the intent, certainly wasn't that at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And fun fact, together with partnership with Republic Bank and a consulting company known as Minnow, we have these books being distributed throughout the high school system currently in
Fantastic.
Trinidad and Tobago. So yeah, I recommend it if this story appeals to you. You certainly don't have to go out there if the story doesn't appeal and pick it up. Yeah.
Cool. And so once again, appreciate your time. I know the VP's time is incredible, and to get an hour and a half of a VP from IBM, especially if someone was in there to be like, okay, you need to step right to grab an hour and a half of my time. So greatly appreciate you sharing your lessons, and I hope folks on the call pay attention and use it to chart a great career for themselves.
So Mark, I thank you as well. As I said before, you're making a significant investment also, right? And all our times are valuable, to be clear. So I appreciate your investment in making this successful. And I know together we will, and proof will be in the pudding for many generations. So thank you as well.
Much appreciated. All right, you have a good one.